privacy is the state or condition of being free from being observed or disturbed by other people. The ability to control or manage the information that others know about you. Dictionary definition of information security is the state of being protected against the authorized use of information, especially electronic data, or the measures taken to achieve this. So fundamentally, privacy is about you and your information, whether you as a person or an entity, like a business. And security is the process of protecting that information, of isolating it and protecting it. With that entree, I'd like to introduce our two speakers. Oh, actually, the first speaker. Our first speaker is Fred Wilf, an experienced technology and intellectual property lawyer, and he will be our initial presenter. Fred?
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate that. So, we have a lot to discuss. First, an overview of what we'll be discussing. I'm going to start off with the fair information principles, which is kind of the undergirding foundational principles in privacy. Talk about which law applies. U.S. federal laws, U.S. state laws, including CCPA, which has been getting a great deal of interest. And talk a little bit about privacy law outside the U.S. with a focus primarily on GDPR, which is the best known and perhaps the most stringent of the privacy laws that are out there. Then Chris will pick up and and provide an overview on security, talk about governance, leadership, and management, security frameworks and standards, and important takeaways. So let's get started. We talk about privacy law, and it's interesting in a lot of ways, not the least of which is it's an old problem, but a relatively new set of laws. Not surprisingly, a lot of the problems that we're writing laws about are because of this newfangled invention called the computer, which suddenly makes it much easier to capture information about people, sell it, share it, abuse it, otherwise do all sorts of nasty things with it, such as committing identity theft. But identity theft has been around for a very long time. We talk about Jacob stealing the identity of Esau. We have Martin Guerre from the 1500s. A lot of more recent examples as well. Hell, back in the 1980s, one of my professors at Rutgers flaked out. It wasn't until 6 months later we realized that he wasn't a Scottish professor of business who had come to New Jersey. He was actually a former electrical engineering professor who had been defrocked and thrown out of another university. And he stole the Scottish professor's identity in order to get a job. He was later convicted. But this sort of thing's been going on as long as there have been humans. After all, think about it. Who controls information about you? Who determines you are the person that you say that you are? On top of that, if somebody is interested, why should that person be himself or herself when he can claim to be somebody better? So identity theft's been around as long as there have been humans. It's only recently that we've had to try to wrap laws around it. And unfortunately, we've been writing lots and lots of laws in lots of different places that apply in lots of different ways. So there's been what I often refer to as a blizzard of laws. So we're going to try to talk about a few today before we get into the security aspects. So let's talk about the fair information principles. You can think of this as the foundation of privacy law. We're trying to figure out here what are we trying to do with these laws? What are we trying to implement? And you'll see some or all of these principles reflected in the laws that have been passed and that we're now trying to work with. So there's 8 fair information principles, the first of which is a limitation on collection. We don't want to collect any more information than absolutely necessary. We certainly don't want to collect it without the knowledge or consent of the data subject. Who's the data subject? You're the data subject. I'm the data subject. We're all data subjects. We call the human about whom this information is collected the data subject. Data quality. The personal data should be relevant, accurate, complete. The question is, if data is being collected about us, is that data correct? Is that data complete? Is it current? The purpose specification. Why is this data being collected? Certainly, it makes for a great business plan to buy and sell data these days. There's a lot of money right now in it, but in order to be fair in how the data is collected and used, we want to be able to explain to the data subjects and to ourselves and understand, why are we doing this? Why are we collecting specific data and for what purpose? How will it be used? Which gets to the next one, which is the use limitation. How is this data going to be used? Who is it going to be disclosed to? We can also put limits on there that any purpose other than the purpose that is stated is not permitted. We simply say, okay, we're going to collect this data, we're going to use it for this purposes and not for any other purposes. Next slide. We're going to have some security safeguards in there. This is going to be the focus of Chris's talk. We want to make sure that once the data is sitting in a database someplace, that the person who controls that database uses reasonable security to keep out the bad guys. Openness. We want to be open and understand everything we're doing with personal data, how we develop it, what are the practices, what are the policies. We want to have all that to be transparent. We also want individual participation. The data subjects have rights. We all have rights. In fact, in the US, the right to privacy is considered to be a penumbral right, which is a fancy way of saying that if you look at the Constitution, the word privacy doesn't appear, but if you read through the Constitution, aspects of privacy are found in several different articles and amendments in the Constitution. It's kind of, they call it penumbral because it is like the penumbra of a flame. It is found more in the reflection than it is found in the main body of the document. By contrast, in other places, including Europe, the European Union, privacy is an express constitutional right. So the data subjects have the rights to learn whether the data controller has data relating to them, to receive copies, to challenge the denials of requests, and so on. Next slide. Accountability. The person who controls or has access, who is in charge of the data, who controls the data, we call them a data controller. You're accountable for complying with all of these principles as implemented in the laws. So we talk about a privacy management program. We want to make sure that the data controller actually implements the laws as referenced by these principles. That includes, among other things, if there's been a breach, to tell us. That's a data breach notification law. Next slide, please. As part of the blizzard, it's not just a matter of there are so many laws out there. There are a ton of laws out there. Dozens and dozens and dozens in the US alone. The other issue that makes things even more complicated from the legal side is that different privacy laws apply on different bases. What is the jurisdiction? If you have a citizenship issue where a Massachusetts law applies only to Massachusetts residents, a California law applies only to California residents. You can also look at residence and location of a person. For example, the European Union law applies to anybody who happens to be in Europe. And there's even been some discussions of, well, if you have an American tourist visiting Europe, is that person subject to GDPR, which is the European privacy law? And the answer is, yeah, probably. So wherever that person happens to be, where that person has a residence, where that person has a citizenship, whether it's state or local, different laws apply. And if you move from one state to the other, then the state where you now live is the state that now applies. Is a data hard copy or is electronic data? In the US, many of the privacy laws apply only to data that is stored electronically. It does not apply to hard copy. So if you have all of your personal information that you store for your business on 3x5 inch hard copy pieces of paper, you got an old card file, these privacy laws may not apply to some of those. By contrast, the more recent laws and some of the laws, for example, in the EU, apply to all personal information, regardless of whether it's hard copy or electronic. We also look at where the data is stored or processed. And I find myself, I spoke to a client this morning asking the client, well, okay, you have some personal information you're gathering. It's sitting in AWS, Amazon Web Services. Where is Amazon Web Services physically storing that data? Which of their data centers? Is it a data center in the US? Is it a data center in Europe? Is it a data center in Asia Pacific? And for the US data centers, are those data centers in New York, Virginia, California, or in some other state? Because where that data is physically located, where the data sits on a computer somewhere, the law applies to that little bit of ground. So your interface becomes the bottom of the computer hitting the floor. That's what determines what law applies sometimes. We also look at how the data is used and why the data was collected. As we'll see with the US especially, we get into different laws for different types of uses. Is it in the healthcare context? Is it fintech? Or is it something else? We also look at how old the data subject is. We have specific laws for kids. Can is a business allowed to even ask a child information about that child? What the hell is verifiable parental consent, and how are you going to get it? If you're selling and providing services to little kids, you suddenly have to get a verifiable parental consent before you can even talk to the kids, start asking them questions. If you're looking at a Disney site, or if you dealt with one of those sites, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It even gets a little interesting where what type of device the data is stored on. For example, the Massachusetts law makes a difference, creates a distinction between personal information stored on laptops versus personal information stored on desktop computers, and how that's and whether or not encryption is required. So with all these different issues, with all these different ways by which the privacy law may apply, it just makes it that much more difficult to follow. Next slide. Let's talk about US. For the most part, especially the federal level, data privacy is sectoral. We have different laws for financial privacy, health privacy, education, communications, marketing, you name it. This is whack-a-mole. Essentially what happens is Congress sees a problem, whacks it with a statute. The first of these, which we'll get into later, although I probably won't go into any great detail, it was the Federal Credit Reporting Act, FCRA. That goes back to the 70s when suddenly people started gathering data on credit ratings, credit worthiness in connection with credit cards. And of course, because that was very popular, and the people who developed these databases saw that they could also make money not just by selling credit cards, but also by selling the credit information. Fair Credit Reporting Act came about because suddenly people were being told that they could not be hired, not because they were bad at their job, but because they had a lousy credit rating. So Congress passed Fair Credit Reporting Act, FCRA, and what FCRA does, among other things, is, as it turns out, it set a template for all the subsequent privacy laws at the federal level. Let's see a very specific problem, how this personal information is being captured, makes specific requirements as to how that data will be managed, who can get access to it, how a data subject can get information about himself or herself from that database. Well, that's in the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And by doing that, we then end up doing the same thing again for data that's collected in the healthcare industry, data that's collected in the financial services industry, and on. So we're playing whack-a-mole. Next slide, please. FTC Act is really not a privacy law. It's a much broader Consumer Protection Act, and it has language in there about any unfair or deceptive practices. However, the FTC and the FTC Act has become sort of a general privacy law and privacy protection. FTC has been and continues to be the go-to for most federal privacy laws that are not otherwise administered by a different group or a different agency within the federal government. So it's a catch-all, if you will. The great thing about FTC, like as with most of these cases and with most of these laws, there's a lot of good information on their website that can help businesses comply with all the laws that the FTC administers. Next slide, please. COPPA is Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. It's been around for a while, and it's always interesting to see how children use information, how children interact with databases. Because under the law, any website that works with little kids has to be able to get verifiable parental consent in order to get any information from those children, ask those children to provide information. And of course, in the early days, it was tough to figure out whether or not the adults were even online or could be reached through a computer at all. Now, that's still an issue, of course, for many people, but it's less of an issue than it used to be. Still, if you find that you're in a business or you're working with a business that is collecting information from kids, or more to the point, it's attractive to little kids. You see a 10-year-old playing with a particular website, even though it's not a Disney site. You should look at COPPA, because COPPA applies. Next slide, please. GLBA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, formerly known as the Financial Services Modernization Act, is fintech. So whether it's an insurance company, a bank, securities firm, you name it, here we have a full-blown federal privacy regime. We have separate rules for privacy, safeguards, disclosure rule, red flags rule. All these different rules apply for different aspects of how the data is captured, how the data is used, when the data must be provided back to the data subject. And it's all specifically for financial institutions. Now we'll see similar approaches also in other areas, but there's nothing that says that this couldn't have been done with one set of rules across several different industries, but this is very specific to financial services. Next slide. And HIPAA is the health side of this. If I understand correctly, until HIPAA came about, the Internal Revenue Code was the largest single U.S. law and set of regulations in at least as far as U.S. is concerned. HIPAA took that crown away. So between the regulations and the statute itself, it's a longer piece of text than the Internal Revenue Code. So anytime that you have data connected directly to the provision of healthcare, whether it's electronic health record, whether it's an insurance claim, anything else related to the actual provision of healthcare, it's under HIPAA in the US. We have the privacy rule, which sets out what information must be kept private. We have security rule, again, standards to determine security. We have also standards for electronic transactions. We have a lot more than that, but this, again, we're just trying to provide an overview here. Next slide. under the HIPAA omnibus rule, we have a specific set of provisions in case of breach. So this is a data breach, a security breach. Rather than go to a state data breach notification law, you go to the HIPAA omnibus rule, the specifically the security breach notification rule within HIPAA that is specific to HIPAA. Okay, next, please. I mentioned the Fair Credit Reporting Act. You're capturing data, and you may have seen this as well. You go for a job and you get this piece of paper saying, oh, by the way, your potential employer has checked your credit to see whether you should be hired. This really applies to really any credit reporting agency and any use of credit. So this is still, though, independent of the Financial Services Modernization Act. They go kind of hand in glove if you look at them closely, but they have very different histories to them. Okay, next slide. Can spam. So this is interesting for a couple reasons. With the blizzard of state laws, with all these laws coming out of the states, and we'll get to those in a few minutes, the question comes up, why don't we just have a single federal law? After all, Congress can preempt the field, which is another way of saying that Congress can say the states can't write laws in this field. Why can't we just have one privacy law? The problem is a couple-fold. One is that Congress just has not had the political will to do so. They've been asked, no question about it, but they just haven't done it yet. And maybe they will and maybe they won't. On top of that, some privacy organizations are not in a rush to see Congress do that. And CAN-SPAM is one of the reasons, because the reason why CAN-SPAM Act was passed by Congress is that some states have passed fairly detailed laws that gave individuals the right to sue spammers. And that was worrisome to some people because they're worried that suddenly everybody would be suing everybody else on anything that looked like that was an unwanted email. So Congress preempted the field. The states are not allowed to write laws about spam anymore. And of course, we know it's all been successful because nobody on this call is getting spam anymore. So the concern now is if Congress takes off and does a general privacy law, they might do the same thing and come up with some law that has less teeth in it. Next slide. Now, actually, for the next couple of slides, I'm going to ask you to go forward. These are examples of laws that are privacy laws that I'm just not going to get into because we don't have the time. And frankly, I think you get the idea. So next slide. Next slide. Next slide. And I'll talk about state laws. And again, even though we skipped a whole bunch, there's more where that came from. So be glad that we're going through this pretty quickly. Let's talk about state laws. Again, many of the states have passed their own laws, and to a certain extent, it's both the good and the bad of the great experiment in law, where the states can basically feed off each other. One state passes a law, another one looks at it and says, that's a great idea, but I think you're missing a piece over here. And they write their own law that's a little bit different. As a result, we have 50 different security breach notification laws in 50 different states. Yeah, and on top of that, it's not just whack-a-mole, it's can you top this? California has passed a number of laws. Other states have tried to either follow California or top California on certain aspects. That's where the security breach notification laws come from. Other states, such as New York, tried very hard to be the fintech capital of state privacy law by having the most stringent state privacy laws for financial technology. I have here reference to NCSL, which is a group that tracks state laws and provides a very good page to explain what are the current laws in each state. Okay, next slide. Just as we have children's online privacy protected at the federal level, we also have it protected at the state level. Now, one thing that California added when it wrote its own version of COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, was a right to erase. This is also sometimes called the right to be forgotten, which sounds more poetic. The idea is that if you have information about a minor in a database, then that person's guardian can ask that the data be deleted at any time. It also limits access to and use of that data to sell bad stuff to kids, such as alcohol and cigarettes. Next slide. We're going to go through some of these pretty quickly. So next slide. And let's keep going. Next. And one more. Another. Keep going. You're getting the idea here. Next. Massachusetts has played Can You Top This with the, after seeing a California law. One thing they require is that whereas most states say you don't have to encrypt personal information, but you're encouraged to, Massachusetts says you must encrypt personal information of Massachusetts residents if that information is portable. And then they define portable to mean the data is going back and forth to a website. It's on a portable device, such as a laptop or a smartphone, a jump drive, thumb drive. It means that it's on portable media. However, if that same data is sitting on a desktop, it doesn't need to be encrypted. The data sitting on Amazon Web Services or some other web host, it does not need to be encrypted. Go figure. But you do have to have a written information security program. Let's go to the next slide. California has been getting a lot of publicity for the CCPA, California Consumer Privacy Act. This was passed, I believe, in 2018. It took effect January 1st of this year, and the Attorney General in California has stated that they will start enforcing the law effective July 1st of this year. Now, to make things even more interesting, they're in the third version of the regulations as of March 11th. And we're not sure yet whether those regulations are going to be the final regulations or not. So we're still making a bunch of guesses. The CCPA came out of an approach to actually pass by vote a law that was a public initiative. A gentleman named Alistair McTaggart wanted to basically take the European law, the GDPR, and bring it to California. The legislature said, instead of doing that, we will use a smaller version and make it a regular law and have the legislature pass it. What it does is, even though it's called the California version of GDPR, it's really just a collection of the greatest hits in privacy law. Consumers may request a business to disclose what is collected, the source of that, the business purpose. You may also require a business to delete personal data, opt out of any sale of that person's own data. And on top of that, the business is not allowed to discriminate against consumers who opt out of use of that data. Next slide. The regulations I've already mentioned. The law took effect January 1st. The regulations take effect and will be enforced beginning July 1st. There's a lot of prescriptions here. There's a lot of language in the regulations and in the law that says you must do this. You must have, for example, if you are selling personal information, you're a business that sells personal information, you must have a link that says, do not sell my information. That has to be a link or a page or another process. You require a lot of, that you do a lot of things, you have a lot of processes. Next slide. Now we're going to go outside of the US. The European Data Protection Directive was passed back in 1995, and the attempt there was to come up with a framework for laws that would be the same for privacy across Europe. Then in effective 2018, the GDPR took over. Essentially, the GDPR is a reboot of the old privacy directive. Now, instead of using a framework, we have a single regulation across all of Europe. It applies to all personal information. It is essentially one law, one set of regulations, and one set of authorities who control it, even though the authorities are still broken up by country by country. It limits the use of data in 1,000 different ways, but mostly what it does is it says that a business can only collect data that's absolutely necessary for the particular use. It gives people the right to complain to the data protection authorities, who can then go in and say, no, you can't do that. You can't collect that data. You can't. And even if a business has multiple databases and wants to combine them, the data protection authority can go in there and say, no, you can't. On top of that, because the GDPR right now is probably the most stringent privacy law in the world, they also state that and also require that any data that's collected and subject to GDPR cannot be forwarded to countries that have lesser protection. So you can't bring in data from the EU into the US, which has lesser protection than the EU, unless the US entity that receives that protection agrees to be bound by EU law. Next slide. So either the company in the US agrees to a set of standard contractual clauses, or if it's a multinational, they have what are called binding corporate rules. There's also a process called Privacy Shield. These are all ways by which a US entity binds itself to EU law. Next slide. And we'll forget the right to be forgotten. Next slide. Other countries are following GDPR, including, as you see, the US. They're becoming more stringent. Next slide. So the takeaways from the legal side: if you're a US-based business, you want to keep all that personal information you collect, preferably on servers physically located in the US, because then you can better manage that information. And you can do that with most cloud-based providers and hosts. When in Rome, if you are collecting information outside the US, or you're otherwise sharing information with somebody outside the US, get local counsel, make sure you have a hosting service that understands these local laws and regulations. A lot of the US entities do not. Larger ones do, such as AWS, Rackspace, Microsoft, Google. But some of the smaller ones do not. Eventually, Congress may preempt state laws regarding the data privacy, given this blizzard, but don't hold your breath. In the meantime, the takeaways include: don't collect any personal information you don't need, learn to comply with the regulations you must comply with, and where possible, encrypt all that personal information, because that's going to help you. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Bob, who will introduce Chris.
Thank you, Fred. We'll take about a 2-minute break to give you a chance, if you need it, to type out your questions and send them to Zoe that you want to direct to Fred. As remember, we don't want to lose your questions. We want to have them sent to Zoe, so we're sure we get them asked of Fred and Chris. As Fred said, our next speaker is Chris Shull. Chris is a highly experienced Chief Information Security Officer and consultant who has experience working for and with companies of all sizes. All sizes meaning large corporate down to small business, almost mom and pop level, all the way up to the international corporations. Chris, when you're ready.
Thank you, Bob. So I'll mention that for those of you who replied to the SurveyMonkey survey about some of the questions, we've been trying to answer some of those questions in the process here, and hopefully we will have succeeded by the time I'm done. But if not, that's another place to resubmit them through the chat, because I think we we believe we're going to cover them all. So if you're not satisfied, let us know. So again, I'm gonna go back to what Fred said about the security and the privacy laws. So, the laws say a lot about, all that stuff Fred was talking about. And I'm just going to like zero in on this number 5 of the Fair Information Principles, which is security safeguards. And so, there are lots of reasons why you need to safeguard information. All the regs you can see in column 1 here, HIPAA, COPA, TCPA, CAN-SPAM, all the things that Fred was talking about. There are also, regulations that have more to do with security. And HIPAA is interesting because it shows up on both columns, because there is both a privacy standard and a HIPAA and a security standard. Sarbanes-Oxley, PCI DSS. If you process credit cards, the payment card industry data security standard applies to you at some level or another. FERPA for higher education, or for education in general. Dodd-Frank. New York DFS 500 only applies to financial institutions licensed in the state of New York. But New York's SHIELD Act is a new act that went into effect in March this year that requires all companies anywhere to protect the data of New York residents. And a lot of it has to do with those same sort of privacy rights. But again, there's this requirement for reasonable safeguards, which, not to cast aspersion on attorneys, but attorneys generally love the word reasonable, because, it can mean what you want it to mean. The other thing I've seen a lot of with my clients is that if you may not be directly covered by these regulations, but your customers may be. And so, over the past 10 years, everybody's realized, that the regulators have all realized, the auditors have all realized, that just because you outsource something doesn't mean it's now secure. And as a matter of fact, they've made it so that you can't dodge your responsibility by outsourcing anymore. And so, my clients, I have one client that is a small startup. They have 10 employees. They provide human resources software to multinational companies like Thomson Reuters. And, Thomson Reuters comes around and expects them to reasonably safeguard the highly confidential information that they process for Thomson Reuters. So one thing I've seen with the corporate customers is, 5, 6, 7 years ago, they would give you a questionnaire and they would ask for a copy of your written policies. And that was kind of the end of it. And the amount of due diligence that these companies are doing today is just extreme. They either are coming on site to audit you themselves, or they are requiring a SOC 2 audit, or an ISO 27001 certification, or something else along those lines. So if you've dodged this so far, the holes in the net are getting smaller and smaller. So let me just talk about, the benefits, if you will. It's a two-edged sword, if you will, of the word reasonable. It changes over time. It depends on the circumstances. And it's really defined and then redefined again by the community over and over again. And so what was reasonable a while ago probably isn't anymore. And so, it's very important to keep progressing. I had a client ask me a couple of years ago, like, when are we going to get to stop worrying about all this security stuff? And it's like, well, when accidents stop happening and when bad people stop doing bad stuff is probably about when we'll get to do that. And what's reasonable changes over time, because frankly, the threats change over time. one of the things that's very clear about, the community is the standards and the frameworks and the audit guidelines that the auditors use also change over time. I actually work with a group called the Cloud Security Alliance, and I'm working with their research group that is developing version 4 of their cloud controls matrix. Not that, not because version 3, which was published 3 years ago, is all that bad, but there are ways to improve it. And as new threats come out, it becomes paramount that we actually change the framework, the controls matrix, to address the new needs. So, I want to make some real practical advice for everybody on the call. What do you have to do to reasonably secure information? I suspect that's what most of you on the call most want to take away is, how do I do that without killing myself? And so, I think of this as if you want to get anything done in your company, you have to put somebody in charge of that. You have to assign it. And so the first thing you have to do is make somebody responsible for security. You probably also have to have somebody responsible for privacy and worrying about all those issues. But if you don't put somebody in charge, probably nothing's going to get done. I mean, they not only have to be in charge, they have to be held responsible. You can't have the person reporting at the lowest level of the organization. They need to be supervised by an officer of the company and reporting at a very high level, probably to the board or the owner. In financial services, they very often have a risk committee. In other industries, the board will often have an audit committee. And there should be a relationship where the security, the information security stuff, the compliance, and the real risks that the company faces are presented to the people at the board on a regular basis, at least annually. I know many companies that do it quarterly. Doesn't have to be a long time, but it needs to be done regularly. Okay, so the next thing is to figure out which framework is the one you should use. We've mentioned, the International Standards Organization specs, the ISO standards. I mentioned NIST, I believe, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. There are the American Institute for CPAs, the AICPA has something called SOC 2. These are all really good frameworks or audit checklists, depending on how you want to look at them. And you should pick the one that's good for you. You may need to pick multiple ones. And then all of them require you to start by doing some kind of formal risk assessment. And then to run a program that prioritizes and manages those risks. And that's really the key to cost effectiveness. And so if you then move on and say, okay, so let me pause there. So having picked some kind of framework, done some kind of risk assessment, and then prioritize and manage the risks. Let me just pause and talk about some of the different frameworks. I got into this a little bit. I'm just going to highlight for you all, if anybody does any work at all with the Department of Defense, they are just now publishing, you'll see this in the seventh bullet down, DoD Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. This is a new thing that's just coming out this year and eventually will apply to all 300,000 plus Department of Defense contractors and subcontractors. And it's a very nice model, but these are all frameworks that you could pick from. So again, going back to being really super practical, risk assessment and management of those risks. You know, I'm working with a hospital right now. Curiously enough, that hospital is covered by HIPAA. Okay, that's not a surprise. The number one thing that healthcare providers get dinged on in HIPAA audits is the failure to do a formal risk assessment. They jump right into upgrading the firewall and putting all kinds of security widgets in, and they do all kinds of technical stuff. They do training, they do everything they need to do, but they don't actually document their risk assessment. And so for my hospital client at the moment, I am working on their annual risk assessment right now because, well, not right now, but you know, this week and next. And the goal is to be able to go to their governance committee and say, here are the risks we're facing. These are the ones we're managing pretty well, and here are the ones we're not managing so well. And with the current levels of funding, you know, there's not a lot we're going to be able to do to change that. And are you willing to accept the risks that result from that? That's, you know, what governance really has to do. In terms of the practical things that, you know, you can do technically, the things that I think your risk assessment is going to tell you you need to do, especially from a privacy protection point of view, as Fred ended up, he said, encrypt, 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 as the final words of advice. And, you know, that means I'm going to reiterate. I'm going to say encrypt that data, that personally identifiable information, whatever that, frankly, any non-public information. If you can encrypt it while it's in transit, that's what everybody recognizes as a little lock symbol in their browser. That's one way to do it. There are a lot of others. That data should also be encrypted at rest. You know, if you're an iPhone user, there is no way to make it so your device is not encrypted. If you are an Android user, you can turn it on, but most manufacturers make it optional. If you are a Mac OS user, you have to turn it on, but it's built in. If you're a Windows user, if you use Windows Professional, it's built in, but it's optional. And if you're a Windows Home user, it's not even built in. I think that's kind of sad because, you know, even those home users have their tax return maybe stored on their disk, all kinds of PII, and at some point they're going to throw that machine out or it's going to wear out and their data will be exposed because it's not encrypted. So that's I'll say the number one thing you can all do in protecting the privacy of the information that you are entrusted with. In terms of the other things that you should do, the next most important thing from a security point of view is to enable multi-factor, or sometimes people call two-factor authentication, on all your important accounts, your email accounts, your bank accounts. You know, if I have apps in my phone, I probably have 15 different things that require two-factor authentication right now. Between the different email accounts I have, my Amazon account has two-factor. My LinkedIn account has two-factor. My Facebook account has two-factor. My PayPal account has two-factor. And what I see in the real world is that when people have two-factor authentication turned on, they no longer have their accounts compromised. I can't tell you how many people I know who have lost control of their email accounts or their Facebook accounts because somebody sent them some phishing email that made them think they had to re-enter their password. and they thought it was going to Google or to Office 365, and it really wasn't. It was really going to the hacker who now had access to your accounts. And from a business point of view, if this is your business account and you have PII in that, you can end up being liable for tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of costs. And if you don't have the right kind of cyber insurance, you are on your own. Typically, your general liability and professional and commercial liability insurance don't cover cyber theft of data. So that actually brings me to the second point, which is the security awareness training and phish testing. Now, for all of those of you who are a solo practitioner, you're here today because you're interested in this topic, but it is really easy to trick people into clicking on the link. I have clicked on the link. Fortunately, only the testing links, not the real links, but I've had clients who have phished me, and in hindsight, you just go, oh my goodness, I can't believe I did that. I assume everyone has a LinkedIn account, and everybody probably gets all the notifications from LinkedIn into their personal email account. That's where mine come to. But one day I got a LinkedIn invitation from the president of one of my clients in my work account. And I just clicked on the link. And that's all it takes, unfortunately. But if I thought about it, that wouldn't have worked, So there are a lot of easy, free resources you can get to for security awareness training and phish testing. That's kind of hard if you're a company of one to set up a phish test against yourself, because you're kind of going to know it's coming. But, I would encourage you to read some articles about it every once in a while. If you have a company with multiple employees, I would encourage you to, talk to somebody like me who can connect you with a service that will do this for you and for your employees. And it's really quite affordable. It's the tune of like $50 per user per year, which compared to the tens of thousands of dollars it's going to cost you if somebody's account gets hacked is a pretty reasonable thing. Number 5 on this list is this asset inventory thing. Do you know what devices, servers, services, and data you have? I'm a solopreneur, or a solo professional consultant, and I'm pretty sure I know what all my devices are. I don't really have any servers, but I use a lot of services, and just keeping track of stuff is pretty hard. The good thing for me is that I don't actually keep a lot of personal information, so I'm not too much on the hook. I don't process credit card information. I don't get healthcare information. I get out of jail free cards on a lot of the things that we were talking about with these regulations. On the other hand, it would be really professionally embarrassing if I were to get hacked, and I'd have to tell all my clients. Number 6, this is, I can't emphasize this enough. Fred said the same thing. This is one of those principles. It used to be, we just, as an IT guy, we used to save every piece of data because disk space was cheap. And we just keep everything forever. And I can't emphasize to you how much of a liability that is. If you lose that data, every extra piece, every extra person you have data about is one more notification. I think the current estimate is that it costs you about $200 per person to handle the breach and the breach notification. So if you can trim down your list, that's a good thing. I had a situation a few years ago where one of my clients was, they collected Social Security numbers from students that were applying to their program. so that they could pass those Social Security numbers on to the financial aid people. And then they did nothing with them. And unfortunately, that nothing included not deleting them. And we realized that we had 10 years worth of applications with Social Security numbers attached to them. And it represented, if we had to pay $200 per record, if we had a breach, it would have been twice our annual revenues, not profit, revenues. And by realizing that we really only need to keep the stuff for a few days until we passed it off to financial services or financial aid, we reduced that liability by about 99.9% in just about 60 days. So that's a great example of how to reduce your vulnerability. So some other things you can do, these are more sophisticated things. Someone in the questions from SurveyMonkey asked what to do to prevent, ransomware. Well, the security awareness training is key, but assuming that eventually somebody's going to click on something that they wish they hadn't, I'm going to point to this idea of having a 24/7 security operations center looking over your shoulder, looking at some sort of sophisticated anti-malware, which used to be called antivirus, on all of your computers, and also monitoring all your system and network logs for indications of breach. And so these services, again, can be quite affordable. It's not quite the $50 per user per month or per year price, but it can be affordable. Most important for your protection against ransomware is making sure you have good backups that are both tested and isolated. Because even if all of your preventions, it's just layers of defenses and onions. And if somebody eventually manages to get through them, your one safety is the ability to restore from a good backup. And what we've seen over the past few years are a couple of problems. One is too many people keep their backups online right next to their primary storage. And so the bad guys encrypt that too and ransom that as well, and you don't have any defenses at all. Over the past year, maybe even less, to turn up the pressure on the victims of ransomware, the bad guys have been increasingly also stealing your data so that they can publish it. There was just a case hit the news today about a white glove New York law firm that deals with A-list celebrities like Robert De Niro and Madonna that has ransomware. Their website is still down. And some of the data of these celebrities, including Madonna's contract from her something Hello the World tour, was released as evidence that they have stolen all the data. And this law firm is now in a very uncomfortable position of probably having to pay a big ransom, hoping that they will be able to decrypt their data. And secondly, that the bad guys will in fact not release the rest of it. Truly a terrible situation. So backups don't help you if the people are going to steal your data and release it. That's where that intrusion detection or that log monitoring thing comes in, the thing right above. I mean, I've seen situations where malware gets installed on a computer and it's detected within a minute or two, and we are able to block it from continuing to work. And we can look at the network logs and see that only a few bytes of data was sent out by that code, which then makes it really easy to sort of say, look, if it's only a few bytes of data, we don't really have, the data has not been exfiltrated, and that's a good thing. So I'm going to let you, leave as an exercise to the reader, most of the rest of this. Incident response plans are, what do you do if there is an incident? I will just back up to the disaster recovery business continuity plans. The only type of disaster, or shall we say ransomware, is not the only kind of disaster we have to worry about. You also have to worry about, maybe pandemic might be something that might be on top of mind. My first pandemic preparedness situation was with SARS, and coming up with a plan where people, the fear was that we'd have to all work from home for a few days while the office was fumigated if a coworker came down with SARS. Well, this situation we're in now is much worse than that, but not, and I won't claim that it's all due to my efforts, but all of my clients are now, for the most part, working very well from home in every possible way that they can. Granted, the hospital client is still a hospital and is still seeing a lot of patients in the hospital, including treating COVID-19 patients. I have some manufacturing clients that aren't doing a lot of manufacturing right now because, they don't, there isn't much demand. One of them makes consumer products that are just, one of my clients is Conair Corporation, and they make blow dryers and curling irons for hair salons, most of which aren't in business right now. So their business has largely gone away right at the moment. Fred mentioned that the state of Massachusetts requires written information security policies. Most of the regulations, most of the audit standards require this. I can't think of one that doesn't. One thing a lot of small companies do is they start out with one or two guys or gals, and everybody has access to everything. And as they grow, everybody, the new hires, everybody still has access to everything. And at some point when they get to a bunch, 10, 15, 20 employees, it's no longer really appropriate for everybody to have access to everything, which is really this point number 11 here, which is this idea of limiting access privileges to the least permissions people need. So only the people in HR should have access to the HR records, and so on. Number 12 basically says, once a year, you should probably look at all the people in your organization and all the accounts you have active and make sure that everybody who's left the company no longer has an account. And then number 13 is this idea that if you have a bunch of computers on a network someplace, they probably have some vulnerabilities, and there are some tools that you can run to automatically scan them. Their companies will be happy to run those scans for you and explain them to you. And if you have a slightly bigger company, you may be asked to do what's called penetration testing by your auditors, where they actually take vulnerability scanning and they really try to take advantage of the vulnerabilities people are facing. So with that, I think I'm finished, and it's time for questions.
So we have a couple questions that came through. One is for Chris. Do you trust those password management programs and apps for saving your passwords?
Absolutely. I've been using one for 12 years. Couldn't live without it. If you don't feel like paying the license fees for them, for many people, the password keeping technology within your browser, whether it's Firefox or Chrome or Internet Explorer, Safari, doesn't matter. 5-10 years ago, all those browsers stored your passwords in clear text, which is a really bad thing. Nobody does that anymore. All the browsers now encrypt your passwords and store them and keep them pretty safe. So if you don't feel like paying for a LastPass or I use a system called RoboForm, which is not the most popular, but it works very nicely for me. If you don't feel like paying to subscribe to one of those, I would encourage you to just use your browser and make sure that you have to actually log in to get access to them.
Thanks. Next question is, if you are sent a link on a text message on your phone, can that be a scam?
Yes.
Okay. All right, and then next question, also for Chris, what are the top 2 or 3 SaaS companies in the world of malware and intrusion protection?
Ooh. Yeah, that's in the world, I would say, unfortunately, you're talking about IBM and BAE Systems, or the companies like that. Those would probably be the 2 biggest. Another one is called SecureWorks, which was owned by Dell for a little while. I think they're independent again, but their pricing tends to be pretty, what you'd expect going to IBM. There are some local companies that will do it for you much more cost effectively. There's one called BTB Security. There's another one called Black Cipher. And depending on your situation, I could recommend any number of others. Feel free to contact me if you want more follow-up, whoever asked that question.
That was the last one we had in there. So if anyone else has, actually another one just came through. Just was saying you might, or you could highlight the different tech qualifications: CISSP, CNA, CompTIA.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots and lots of certifications out there. I have a few of them myself. The TIA is a more sort of lower level standard. There's a Security Plus certification from Microsoft, which is similar. And then depending on what you're looking for, I mean, you've got things from ISACA, and I mean, I have my main credential in the security world is the CISSP, but you have to have 5 years experience before you're even allowed to take the test. So if you're looking to hire somebody to join your team, that's a nice thing to ask for, but I know lots of people who are really smart about security that don't have that credential. If you're hiring somebody to do your pen test, you want to hire somebody who has what's called a certified ethical hacker credential. And most ethical hackers have that credential because the alternative sounds really bad.
That's all we had in the chat there for questions.
If you have any questions, would you please send them to Zoe right now? If otherwise, we will go ahead and start to work on getting to know each other a little bit.
Oh, we got 2 more. Okay. I have heard stories of SIM hacking wherein our phone is hijacked by a stranger and the phone can no longer work. What is your advice on this?
Yeah, it's a thing. And not only that, but when they hijack your SIM card, they now get all your text messages. So if you have your 2-factor account set up to do, that second factor is getting an SMS message, they now can, if they've guessed your username, if they've got your username and password, they now also get your second factor. The standard advice on this, actually from the National Institute of Standards and Technologies a couple of years ago, is to use the ones that use the app rather than the messaging thing, that form of two-factor authentication. Some services don't really let you do that, but many of them do. But the main thing is to if you yourself, usually to hack your SIM card, they have to, the bad guys have to convince your phone company that you have a new phone. And obviously they then call up and they social engineer their way into that. And there are some things you can do with your phone company to tell them that you're at risk of that, perhaps if you're not particularly at risk of it. The truth is that SIM hacking usually happens in what's called an advanced persistent threat situation, where somebody very specifically is targeting you. It could be because you're, the lead scientist and the Chinese want your science. It could be because it's, some estranged ex-boyfriend or girlfriend who is out to get you. But it's amazing. I saw a demo a couple of years ago of a woman who basically sat down with a guy and said, "Look, I bet you I can get into your phone account. All I need is your phone number." And she called AT&T, and she had a YouTube video of a crying baby, and she basically played the crying baby and pretended that she had just gotten married and that she was calling on behalf of her husband, and the husband wanted her to change the address and to order a new phone for her, and so on and so forth. And every once in a while she just played this baby crying, and the customer service person did what customer service people do. They tried to be helpful, and they basically skipped over all the security questions, because the poor woman basically, "I don't know, my husband asked me to do this and the baby's crying." And she got not only a new device sent to a new address and added a line to the service and changed the password to the account in like 45 seconds. It was amazing. So, at some point you need to have, an alert on all your accounts that say, "Don't let anybody do that to me."
Wow, that was an advanced advanced method there. We have a couple more. I'm trying to read if this is a comment or a question. Comments on ISP tracking and data collection. Wisdom of use of main passwords when out at other places like client sites to access one's systems, even your email.
Yeah. So if you're feeling paranoid, you can use a VPN service. To be honest, if you're logging into your Gmail account from, just about anywhere, that traffic is encrypted. Assuming you see the little lock in the browser. So I think you're probably okay.
Okay, and then, sorry, go ahead.
I'm just saying, from the Starbucks, make sure you get the Starbucks Wi-Fi and not the rogue the extra Wi-Fi point that some hacker put in the Starbucks store. Frankly, I use my phone and I tether my computer to my phone when I have to work in a cafe like that, and I don't trust the Wi-Fi.
Last question. How secure are payment apps, Zelle, PayPal, and on phones, Google Pay, Apple Pay?
They're pretty good. I mean, I use them all the time.
All right, that was all we had there in the chat.
Thank you very much, Zoe. Why don't we move on then to try and do some introductions? I'd ask that as you introduce yourself, and obviously you're going to have to turn off your mute using the space bar as this recommended way. I'd also ask if you haven't been using your video camera, that you turn that on so that we can actually see you. Because on the, as I probably have noticed, the person speaking gets highlighted with a yellow bar or square around their picture. It'd be nice to be able to connect faces with names. Hopefully, I'm sure what I see on my screen is probably not in the same order as on yours. So it's just going to probably look very random. But let's start with Bob Jarvis.
Hey, Bob, thanks. Bob Jarvis, I have my own company which solves the problem of, it's hard to get things done around here. But frankly, I spend most of my time working on beacon stuff.
Carol McCullough.
Hi, I'm Carol McCullough. PhD after my name sometimes stands for Piles Higher Than Deeper. I'm looking for my next president or COO position in the diversified industrial sector. I'm willing to relocate. And in the meantime, I'm helping a bunch of networking groups with their technology and processes. Carol McCullough.
Thank you, Carol. Joe Hare.
Joe Hare with Coastal Force Consulting. I offer information technology and business consulting services in the Mid-Atlantic region. Specifically, I provide project and program management services with a focus around cloud-based ERP, supply chain, and the Salesforce ecosystem. Joe Hare, Coastal Force Consulting.
Thank you, Joe. Ben Johnson.
I double muted. That's because I was on my phone. Hi there, everyone. My name is Ben Johnson. I'm the CEO of Freya Systems. We do a combination of software and data analytics consultancy. Very much we specialize in taking data from big devices, aircraft, trains, that sort of stuff, and creating predictions from it. So Ben Johnson, Freya Systems. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you, Ben. Ben Postero.
It doesn't look like you're muted, Ben, but we're not hearing you.
Oh, Ben's connecting to audio. Kimberly. Sorry, there's no last. Ben? Ben Postero?
Yeah, hi, I'm here. I think you can probably hear me now. Sorry about that. A little bit of a malfunction with on my part with Zoom. Anyway, Ben Pastro, my firm is called A New Metric, and we work with primarily consulting firms that are small and medium-sized, technology-centric firms, and we advise them around growth strategy, building out go-to-market teams, as well as how to build out their operations so they can better scale. The final thing that we advise on is preparing for M&A, understanding the value drivers of the particular business, and accentuating those value drivers as those businesses grow. So thank you very much.
Kimberly, sorry.
Oh, that's no problem. Hi, I'm Kim Wilf, and my firm is called Wilf Marketing Solutions. I provide marketing strategy consulting services to the life sciences industry group, primarily pharmaceuticals, biotech, some medical devices, and yeah, I guess that's the major things. Nice to meet you all, who I don't know. Kim Wilf.
Jeff?
Yes. Jeff Stolman. I'm an independent consultant. I do a lot of work with the defense and intelligence agencies through various contractors that I work for. I've been working in security and privacy for over a decade, and right now I'm trying to get some IP protection for a solution to the right to be forgotten for blockchains.
Thank you, Jeff. Dee Camp.
Hi, my name is Don Campbell, and I am a consultant for voice and internet. So I do voice over IP. The company's name is Crown VoIP and IT. And we also do wide area network solutions. Software-defined wide area networks are now finally taking off and helping people save money and get faster internet connections.
Thank you. Joe Magid. I always struggle with your name, Joe. Joe Magid.
Thank you. Joe Magid, Griffin Solutions. I hate it when I hear managers from companies tell me how their IT department's not getting the job done. So I work with companies on bringing senior management and IT management, as well as line management staff together to address the issues, identify the issues and address the issues that are causing that to happen, and increase satisfaction with IT. Joe Magid, Griffin Solutions. Nice to meet everyone.
Thank you, Joe. Tom Kuhn.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here, for the opportunity to be here. I'm in transition right now, looking for a technical leader position. I basically have excelled at being able to communicate geek items to the non-geek and the rest of the company or organization, and breaking down any interpersonal and intergroup issues that really keep business from moving forward. Tom Kuhn.
Jürgen Heberling.
Hi, this is Jürgen Heberling. Thank you, Carol, for inviting me here today. This is the first time I'm attending your session. My forte is I'm in information security, currently working for both my own consulting company and a CPA firm doing information security assessments and consulting, of course. Looking to flip my role into being back into a leader in an organization as an ISO or a director, information security, or a CISO role. I have a lot of background with ERP systems on the DoD manufacturing side as well. And on the InfoSec side, I do many of the things that Mr. Shull talked about, NIST, SOC, ISO, HIPAA, MOUSE. Thank you, Jürgen Heberling.
Especially like the MOUSE. Bob King?
Hello, my name is Bob King. I recently founded a company called TakePoint Clinical, which was, the idea was to help drug companies initiate their clinical trials more quickly. There's an administrative roadblock on the front end of all trials so they can do research, and I'm expert at helping those companies do it. Unfortunately, the marketing kickoff was supposed to be in April. April never came. So I'm working pretty much full time while I still ramp that up with one of 3 companies which actually has a COVID vaccine in clinical trials right now.
Hopefully they'll do well.
Hopefully.
Joe?
Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Joe Dunn. Thanks, everybody, for the Brady Bunch on steroids here. Retired military, did my CFA, I'm in the middle of my CSIP, looking to be a bigger fish in a smaller pond somewhere in probably operational management or some sort of tech operational management, SaaS, that sort of thing. But no, this was interesting. It's really quite fun. Appreciated it.
Thank you, Joe. And Sri Krishnan. Sri, if you could turn your video on too.
Hi, can you hear me?
We hear you, but we can't see you.
Yeah, I have a problem with my camera. It doesn't let me connect it. It looks like there is some other app that says that some other app is using it. I cannot get out and come back, so that's why I'm sorry about that. Maybe today's talk is making me believe that I should do some security setting even in my camera now. Okay, hello everybody. This is my first time joining this call. My name is Srinivasan Krishnan. I go by Krish. I recently left an healthcare executive VP engineering position from a Fortune 100 company, having a great experience with medical device engineering, primarily in software as a medical device. And I am currently an independent consulting, trying to help the engineering organization who wants to transform the organization to make releases in a short time with the more predictable releases. That's my current forte. I'm still in the beginning of my new role. I'm trying to get some new clients. So that's one of the reasons why I'm trying to get some networking here. My name is Srinivasan Krishnan. Thank you.
Thank you, Sri. And Greg Betts.
Hello, my name is Greg Datz. I am president of Lythan Networks. We're an IT managed services provider We're national, and we provide IT infrastructure services to small and mid-sized companies. We specialize now in remote or turnkey cloud solutions for remote users, which we've been, putting on our cloud platform for years now. We do specialize supporting assisted living facilities and also companies that have multiple sites that need to operate under a single IT standard. Greg Datz, Life and Networks.
Beacon is the premier executive networking organization serving the Mid-Atlantic region. To learn more, go to beaconforlife.org.